Next up, and we're about 3 minutes ahead of ourselves, but I think that's good, is Lucky Ahmed of ClimateX. Lucky is the co-founder and CEO of ClimateX, a member of the Forbes Business Council and several climate-focused initiatives, including Leaders for Climate Action. Previously, over 15 years of international experience with leading financial institutions. He has worked with the likes of HSBC, Hang Seng, Lloyd's Banking Group, and Accenture. So Lucky, are you here? Hello. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I think I'm going to change things up a little bit versus what we've heard about for the last couple of days. So a lot of the conversation that we've had so far has been around how do we hit the brakes on climate change. How do we start to understand better the effects that we have as humans on the environment around us? So my focus really, and ClimateX's focus, has been around really deeply understanding what the impact of climate change is for us as people, and fundamentally how we connect climate change to the impacts to the global economy. That's what we really deeply care about. So it's an important part of the agenda for us in terms of really just recognizing that we have an inevitable lock-in of the impacts of what we've done over the last few decades. Net zero is getting away from us in terms of there's a lot of time. Sorry, excuse me. I'm just having a moment. Sorry. So there's a lot of things that have been happening over the course of the last few decades that now are inevitably locked into our futures. Now, the key things that I'm going to focus on today is not necessarily ClimateX and what we do as a business to try and sell a service to you, but just really going into the challenges that come with understanding climate risk as it pertains to things like physical risk. So when I say physical risk, what I'm really talking about are things like extreme weather events, flooding, subsidence, landslides, wildfires, and so on. And these are the challenges that we're experiencing. So things like black boxes, lack of understanding of methodologies. So how do you take long time frames and connect them to real world impacts today? How do we price for that, for example, in things like asset valuations? There's another piece which is around consistent coverage across different assets and different hazard types. So there's not just one type of risk that's important to us. Depending on where you live and when you're thinking about the exposures, those hazards can materialize in different ways. And so a big part of the work that we're involved in is building impact models. So these are models that connect climate models like from the IPCC that tell us how to expect changes in things like sea level rise, extreme temperature changes, precipitation, to what's going to happen on the ground when, for example, that amount of water hits the ground in New York. What does that mean for this particular building that we're sat in today? So there's different types of hazards that take different disciplines in order to understand them better. And then the third thing is really about validation. It's really difficult to say, you should have confidence in what my models are producing because I can't go into the future. It's not possible for me to go 80 years into the future and say that this model prediction that I provided you today was feasible, right? So how do you start to get confidence around the fact that these models are delivering what they're designed to deliver? And a big part of that is being open about the fact that climate change is really difficult to understand as a concept. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's different potential futures that we might head into. And so these are some of the challenges that we've been grappling with at ClimateX. Fundamentally, the types of customers that we service, my background was in financial services. I spent 10 years with the likes of HSBC, Accenture, in risk management, so probably not the likely candidate to build a business and go into the world of startup. But risk management meant actually how do we enable a more sustainable future anyway within the banking system, and now we're translating that into that industry where the economy is fundamentally at threat if we don't get this right and start pricing climate risk properly. The SEC has been mandating these types of requirements and at least flirting with the idea of mandating these requirements across the US for corporates, for financial institutions. There's some back and forth that's happening now and a lot of challenges coming from the legal system. What does this mean for me and my shareholders and for industry? Places like Europe, where we're based, the agenda's moved far further ahead than where we are today. There's already been forced exercises where corporates and financial institutions have attributed dollar impacts to potential risks decades into the future, and thought about what that means for the capital. So our prospectus now, in terms of how we usually within financial services deal with the risk, is to use Microsoft Excel, right? Excel is the solution to everything. The problem is that Excel doesn't always really excel when it comes to climate change. And one of the big reasons for that is that climate change is non-linear and non-stationary. So that means that we know that the past is not going to be an indication of what the future will look like. So just because a place has never flooded in the past, it doesn't mean that that won't happen in the future. So therefore, we can't take, for example, those past trends and regress them forward with some simple sensitivity analysis or adjustments notching up and down based on how, I don't know, precipitation might affect one area or another. The other issue that I've seen a lot of banks and asset managers try to do is to fill in gaps for different hazards by lifting and shifting the results or trends from other models and applying that directly to a new hazard type. For example, if I've got a particular flood trend based on FEMA data, maybe I can use that to indicate what heat stress might look like in the future and just lift and shift and apply some notching here and there. Those types of things just don't work because of the complexity surrounding this modeling. So, and then the final point, which is really important, is that climate change models, if you do try and procure this data for any particular reason, depending on which vendor you decide to work with, depending on which hazard you're looking at, you might end up with widely different results. It's a bit of a Wild West right now when it comes to this industry because it is so new. There are some places in our markets, like insurance, for example, where climate risk is or has been assessed and built into the way that we think about pricing and the way that we think about our operating models. But this is a new way of looking at risk over longer time horizons, linking them to very specific climate pathways, and then compounding types of hazards as well. So it's really difficult to know what to trust and when, and that fundamentally changes the way that you start doing your business, the way that you price for assets, whether you transact in and participate in a transaction or not. So it's murky waters. So one of the things I'm going to do is just quickly go through how we think about key questions and the types of themes, I guess, that matter when it comes to looking for vendors, looking to understand this type of data. So the first one is just around the hazards. So when I say climate risk, I don't mean one thing. Now, a lot of people here might think of that in terms of transition risk. So what is the cost to moving net zero? What does that mean for my business? Can it pivot itself? Or is it going to become more expensive over time to continue doing business as I am? So that presents a threat to businesses. When we look at physical risks, we're looking at the impact that they can have literally by destroying a building. It could damage your infrastructure, your road, so goods and services in and out could affect the creditworthiness of a business. As I said, flooding or storms, for example, or wildfire, these are not the only types of hazards. You've got acute shocks, which happen more instantaneously. And then separately to that, we also have more chronic risks, so things that creep up on us over time. So subsidence, for example, is one of these emerging risks that we're seeing in the Midwest states, where the ground is literally shrinking and swelling at different rates than what we've experienced in the past. That can destroy property foundations, and that's really expensive to try and fix after it happens. So just understanding that there's a wide range of prospective risks is important. Then we have things around vulnerability. So it's interesting that I might tell you with some confidence that this particular building or this particular part of California might be under threat or exposed to a particular hazard. But actually, that's not useful in and of itself. If I have two different properties that are built of two different things and different sizes, one's residential, one's commercial, the cost of that building being exposed to a hazard won't necessarily be the same, right? So we start taking into account other things like what are these buildings made of? What is the property in terms of its age, its wall types, its square footage, what's the full exposure? That gives us vulnerability data that we can connect to damage curves and then calculate dollar impacts in the form of loss exposures. So that's more useful from a business perspective. So it's about thinking about how to connect the physical risk to vulnerability as well. Then we have validation, which I'll talk about next, but effectively, how do you start to test some of these models and get to real quantifiable metrics that give you confidence in using them for the purpose of risk assessment and pricing and other types of use cases. So I'm going to talk about that in a second in a little bit more detail. Methodology is key. A lot of businesses will typically mask their methodology. So they'll say, this is my core IP, so I don't want you to know it. I don't want to lift the lid on what's happening under the hood. Or they rely so much on AI and machine learning that it's impossible to pick apart why the result is what it is. Now, having come from a regulatory environment and sort of use this data quite extensively, what matters to me is the number is important, yes, but how you got to the number is probably equally as important, if not more so. The story has to make sense, and so we're really keen to make sure that this is democratized as much as possible and peer-reviewed and subject to the right level of scrutiny, so that you have confidence in what's happening under the hood. The other key points, just in the last 5 minutes, so resolution. You'll hear this theme, which is, how do you take these global climate models, which are operating at kilometer grid squares, and they've determined what the temperature gradients or precipitation rates might be over these areas, and localize that down to a specific property. You can go down and build models, impact models, like flood models, down to meter squares, or even centimeters if you wanted to and had enough compute power. Fundamentally, though, where things start to become difficult is how do you validate, for example, that one part of a brick versus another got wet or didn't. You don't get validation data to prove that a higher resolution directly correlates with a higher performance of your models. So just bear in mind that higher resolution is great up to a point, but at some point it starts falling apart to just being hypothetical. Use cases, I won't dive into this in too much detail, but there are a lot of reasons why you want to use this. So just in terms of our customer bases, one part is around assessing your existing exposures. So where do I have properties today? Where have I got counterparties that are lent to large corporates? Where are my data centers that I rely on? Stressing those assets and then getting different potential outcomes across each of them. The second part is around originations. So if you're ever trying to participate in a new transaction, if I gave you data with confidence that said that this building will be underwater in 10 years' time and it's never been exposed to flooding before, is it still worth the same amount of money? For most people, the answer is no. You'd have to adjust the pricing. So as part of the originations process, we're seeing increasingly now that people are interested in factoring in climate risk as part of the decision-making process. And then all of this rolls into your annual disclosures. So you might have TCFD, GRESB, Articles 8, 9, EU taxonomy, and other things. Teams, advisors, because this is new and it's nascent, there's many different ways that you can try and skin a cat. This is not easy. It's pushing the boundaries of what science and academia have been used to doing, and especially in the use case that we're applying it to. And so here it's important to make sure that people aren't working in silos. We work closely with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, with the Met Office in the UK, NOAA, various universities, and we're really trying to make sure that we're as open as we can be when it comes to identifying the challenges with delivering these types of models. Whilst we've got these great PhDs, it's not enough to say that, in our echo chamber, we're comfortable. We can't pat ourselves on the back. We have to be open about who we work with and collaborate with. And then you've got this concept of downscaling, which I mentioned before. If effectively what we're saying is that, if your box or your grid cell is a certain resolution, if I try and build something that's a higher resolution than that itself, then it becomes really difficult, right? So what is that process that's going into making that happen? And how do we make sure that we've got confidence in terms of the answers that it's providing us? And just final 2 points in terms of coverage. Different exposures are very differently connected to climate impacts. So for example, we don't get involved in agriculture so much because agriculture is in itself its own discipline, and there are companies that are focused on climate impacts to agriculture. Our focus as a business is really on the built environment and understanding what's happening to property, construction, places where you might want to develop, or existing assets that you have in the built environment. This is what we really focus on, and that's what our design of our tools have been built to maximize the efficiency of. And then finally is scoring. A lot of people are building scorings and rating systems. Just be wary that if that's all you get, it's probably not going to be particularly helpful. What does a high, medium, low actually mean? Who decided what the parameters are? Or what's a 1 to 100 rating? What does that actually mean? We're fortunate because these impact models, they allow us to get actual measurements. So I can tell you, for example, the millimeter rate of subsidence that we can expect, or the depth of a flood, or the duration of a flood. These are more tangible metrics that you can take to an architect, for example, or to an engineer and say, how do we start to protect against this? How do I strengthen the foundations or build flood defenses that will be resilient to these types of impacts? So that's more useful in terms of data sets. Now, just a quick point in terms of validation in the last few couple of minutes is we don't look into the past to model the future. So just to point this out, and I'm not going to go into the hows of what we do. I can spend literally 2 hours talking about that, and we do with our customers. But in terms of validation, that's where we can look to the past. So effectively what we're doing is we'll say, do our model successfully reproduce events if we take certain inputs as our drivers and then see how that materializes in terms of outputs in the real world. And the way that we do that is to try and compute a number that tells us how good the model is at reproducing those risks. So this example here, for example, tells us in the blue shading that you see, these are outputs from our models, an example of flood model output. The red is showing you what the past observed flooding or where the flooding occurred based on certain levels of rainfall. So we have rainfall data that tells us how much rain happened in this particular space. We know the flooding occurred, so water was where it shouldn't have been. And we can compare our models in a true false positive matrix in order to get a really good precision metric, right? So where did we over or underestimate flooding based on those inputs? Where did we get it right? You know, these places that we said would flood, did flood, and those places that we said wouldn't, didn't. And that gives us an accuracy rating overall. We can then compare that also to idiosyncratic events. So what happens if, for example, there's an unprecedented amount of rainfall in an area? If I take that as my input assumption to my model, does it successfully produce risks as what we've experienced on the ground? So that gives us more confidence when it comes to different types of events or assumptions that the forward-looking climate models might provide to us. So these are really testable things. We do the same on geophysical hazards, for example, so landslides. This map is showing you in the red dots where landslides have been recorded, and then the gray shaded areas that turn into a pink hue. These are places our models said that there's a higher vulnerability to landslide. And so there's a strong correlation between our models and expectations versus what's been recorded on the ground. And we started to see that there's even predictive capability in our models. So this has been happening multiple times over, where we've said that there's particular places that are vulnerable or should be vulnerable to landslide or other types of risk. And then following the running of our models, we've observed that in the real world. You know, and this is happening globally right now, and it's really important to us that this gives confidence that if you're going to use our data to reject a potential transaction or to increase pricing to take care of potential excess losses, that you've got confidence in terms of what we're able to do in terms of validation. So if you want to learn more about what we're doing, you can scan, I believe, that QR code. There are also a lot of resources that we've built to help our customers, generally interested parties, to learn more about climate risk as a topic, but also what that means for you, for your balance sheet, for your P&L, and also just to get more educated on the topic itself. You know, it's a complicated space, and so we're here to help with that education. And then if people need data to access in order to directly assess the risk, we've got solutions for that too. So think of us as basically being a SimCity crossed with Google Maps. That's what we've built to help you analyze your climate risks quite quickly. So I'll pause there. Thank you. Sorry for the shaky start, but that's ClimateX.
Yeah, I'll start off. I have two questions.
Sure.
Before that, thank you for reminding about the trump cards that we use for WWE.
Yeah.
So my first question is, when we do a certain climate vulnerability risk assessment for a particular area, we have flood, we have heat risk, and we have a number of factors included in there. So what is the scale to which you can get down to using your model?
So, yeah. So it depends, the scale and resolution depends on the type of hazard we're interested in. So it doesn't make sense to have the same resolution for everything. So for example, with flooding, we'll go up to 10 by 10 meters, not because technically we can't go any higher, it's because I can't validate data beyond 10 by 10 meters. That's a typical building, so I can tell you this building in the past did or didn't flood. So that's where we stop. When it comes to geophysical hazards, it's more linked to things like the bedrock, aquifers, and various other things that are subterranean. Those drivers don't change every 10 meters, so actually it doesn't make sense. So there we go to 90 by 90 meter scales. I think our global average will end up being at 30 meters, but fundamentally it's 10 meters, sliding scale up to 90.
Thank you. And there are a couple of tools that one that US EPA uses and one that the White House uses for environmental and climate justice. Is something like this, can it be integrated into that, and can we use that data for that?
Yeah, look, I think it's more supplementary and complementary, and it's a different view, right? So a lot of the data that's used by governments or by most institutions today that I speak to is based on past flood maps, so things like FEMA data, for example. That's great to tell you what happened in the past. It's not going to indicate how quickly things might accelerate and change in the future. So absolutely, these are use cases that we get a lot of people approaching us for. It's a different type of data set altogether, but I think it's really useful intelligence.
Thank you.
Ted Cronmiller, Responsible Alpha. Great presentation, Lucky. Really appreciate that. So how are you translating climate risk to, say, a portfolio level? Because I see that you've looked at the relationship between that and the economy, and and I imagine different sectors in the economy. And are you going down to a portfolio level on the physical risk side? And then on the transition risk, when you look at buildings, do you do things like, can you tell us, like, carbon value at risk types of measures?
Yeah, so on the physical risk side, everything is built ground up. So actually, when I say we've got 10-meter grids of risks, we've got 20 trillion data points and growing right now. And all of those data points are telling us for every single location down to that 10 by 10 meters, this is the level of risk that we might expect. So what the customer provides to us would be a longitude and latitude or an address, and we'll give you the data for that. Now, once you've got multiple addresses, you might have 3 million properties, for example, that you're exposed to, then we can aggregate that and group it up at whatever level you want, right? So that's already there. And then if you want to go into the financial risk side, then we've got the metrics that are tied to the vulnerability. So you can assess concentration, either geographically, either by hazard, compounding across all the hazards, or financially. So it's up to you how you want to start to slice the portfolio. On the transition risk side, we're really interested in the building side around energy efficiency. There's a lot of controversies with energy efficiency and Energy Star and EPC ratings, carbon pricing, CREM, you name it. So fundamentally what we found is that the challenge is that there's a lot of different taxonomies that exist. So what we are now doing, because the EPC or energy efficiency ratings just don't exist, we found smart ways to compute the kilowatt per meter squared per year for every single building. There's other ways that I'm not going to go into now that we've done that, but that model's performing to 60-65% accuracy across Europe already, and we've got better data in the US, so we think that we'll hit 80-90% when we get here. Now, we can then apply, once we know what the kilowatt per meter squared usage is, directly to that pricing pathways from CREM or whatever ends up being the accepted methodology to tell you that under different scenarios in the future, if we think there's different pricing curves based on your utilization or expected usage, this is what the cost will be, as well as potential retrofit costs and benefits as well.
Hi, thank you. Andrew Textors from South Pole. We've been building out our abilities with SEC and understanding what the proposed rules really say, and this is a huge part of it. I'm wondering if you see this relaying to the finalized rules that are going to be coming out, hopefully in the next month or so. But do you have any insight on that, and if this is going to carry over to the finalized rules that do come out?
Yeah, look, I think one of the challenges that we've seen this in Europe as well. I don't think that you'll ever have in the next month you'll have finalized rules. I think you'll have some rules, and then they'll keep on evolving as they realize that they didn't really ask the right questions or define what the question should be in enough detail. And in the UK and Europe, we've had these issues already from regulators where they've set rules. An example would be they've asked for flood defenses to be assumed as part of projections, right? And degradation of those flood defenses by X percentage. Now, when it comes to how you interpret that, that's open field. Now, depending on how someone's interpreted that rule, because it's so loose, then you'll end up with different results. So the same result that you're delivered as a quantitative measure doesn't give you the same, isn't answering necessarily the same question. So what we're finding is that actually a lot of the challenges are that the regulators themselves or the trade associations, let alone the banks, they don't have enough guidance in terms of understanding what this data means. And so we are starting to work closely with the likes of ABA, the Association of American Bankers, for example, to help them educate themselves first before they can then start implementing rules and then put capital requirements against that. That's where the dollar hits the road, and that's where the challenges will be. So yeah, I think it'll be an evolving picture.
I think we have time for one last question if there is one. If not, we can end here. Okay, that's it.
Awesome.
You so much,
Thank you.
Lucky.